음. Ajudar tinkos повделя. أنا آه، 마르모 yarchek nima chukba de chagi are.
Today is the sixth day of our Marngo summer teachings,
Da so chi chi be jamne kindu ide.
and I would like to offer my greetings to, in particular, the main focus of our teachings, the Sangha community of the monks and nuns, as well as to all the Dharma friends who live all over the world,
Chiri yunda misi namba.
and also to my
Tongro le ya
Tibetan country people.
zashin sewe ke samji shuyayin.
I would like to offer you my warm and loving greetings.
Dele yang da hazang ajeta nima ni ji rong le ya de me na de ge chegi. Ane sanga da jewe
Now, for the past couple sessions,
sanga da
we have been speaking about the points of philosophy in early Buddhism that are related to the Vajrayana. And so now, starting today, I would like to speak about the Buddha Dharma following the parinirvana of the Buddha. How did it develop? So this is what I would like to give an introduction to. And in order to give that introduction, first of all, you have to know the historical background. And particularly, you need to know the political situation. There are so many different countries, so you need to understand a little bit about the political situation of these countries. It's important to understand this.
Anthony Kennedy wonders at
There was an English scholar named Anthony Kennedy Warder. He was a 20th century scholar, and according to his presentation, during the Buddha's lifetime, the kingdom of Magadha was one of many different kingdoms in India. So at that time, now later, Magadha became extremely powerful, but it was not as powerful at that time. Likewise, the Buddha did meet two generations of the kings of Magadha, the kings Bimbisara and King Ajatashatru. So he did meet both these kings, but it doesn't mean that there was a special or particular connection, according to this scholar. And the reason for this is that at that time, kings had the tradition of generally meeting with the proponents of various different philosophies. And so they probably didn't have just special exclusive connection with the Buddha. For example, when we look at the Jain texts, there's the Jain religion in India as well. And so these are translated into Tibetan as the Jains. They're also called the Nigrantas. And so in their texts, there are many stories of how they say, Jain texts, where they say that Bimbisara and Ajatashatru were followers of the Jain religion and that they were great supporters of the Jain religion. And so for this reason, according to this English scholar, the fact that the two generations of kings of Magadha, two successive kings, met the Buddha does not mean that there was necessary and exclusive connection. Likewise, during his lifetime, went to a minimum of 6 different kingdoms and turning the wheel of Dharma. And the time what he spent in Magadha was actually not all that long. It was only a very short period of time. And so for this reason, the primary areas where Buddha initially spread were not in Magadha. Instead, they were outside of Magadha. It's not that the Buddha intentionally established a wish to make a big connection with Buddha and remained a long time in Magadha. That did not happen. He says, however, over the course of the next 150 years, the regions where Buddhism had spread, the borders of Magadha expanded. And the regions where Buddhism had spread also came to be under the political power of the kingdom of Magadha. And so from that time on, there was a very special connection between Buddhism and Magadha, a more exclusive relation between the two. So this is something that we'll discuss more when we discuss the reign of the Emperor Ashoka. So I won't say too much about it today. So in brief, the particular connection between the Buddhist religion and Magadha, the particular or the special or exclusive connection, developed later as the political situation in Magadha changed. So it's at the same time as that change happened that there was developed a deeper connection between Magadha and Buddhism. During the time of the Buddha, there was not such a special connection between Magadha and the Buddhist religion. This is what this English scholar Anthony Kennedy Warder says. So this is what what Warder says. Now, at that time in India, when we speak about the different countries or the kingdoms in India at that time, we first of all, we need to begin to wonder how many kingdoms were there in India, how many countries? If we are unable to have an idea of that, then when we talk about Magadha and Kosala, then we get confused. So at that time in India, how many countries were there or kingdoms were there? So between the 6th and the 4th centuries BC, and approximately in that time period, there were 16 countries in India. They're called the 16 Great Kingdoms or the 16 Great Countries. And so this is a term. The 16 Great Kingdoms is found in the 16 Great Regions. So this is found in the Tibetan texts, in the Indian texts, the 16 Janapadas. So there are these 16 different countries, and so we call them the 16 Great Countries. And among of these had kings. They were kingdoms countries that were ruled by the king, and sometimes republics, where the people would appoint their own kings. And so within these, some of them were kingdoms ran by kings, and some were more like republics. So here's the list of the names. Now, I don't need to explain each of these, but among them there are the and so these are the names of the countries that we recognized from the text in the Kanjur and the Tenjur in Tibetan. When you talk about Angkor, Kashi, or Kosala, or Magadha. So there are these several countries here. In any case, in India, in the period between the 6th and the 4th centuries approximately, there were 16 great countries in India. It is said. Now, among the 16 great countries, the ones that we're speaking about in particular is the country of Magadha. So this country or kingdom of Magadha was reigned over by several different dynasties. And among these different dynasties, the place we're beginning, we don't need to speak about the dynasties before the Buddha, but during the time of the Buddha, we'll start with the dynasty from the time of the Buddha and proceed from there. So during the time of the Buddha, the dynasty was the Haryanka dynasty. It's the Haryanka dynasty. So the Haryanka dynasty and so there are the names of two kings who show up quite frequently in the Buddha's words and in the treatises. And the first of these is Bimbisara, and the second was Agashata. So the King Bimbisara was a follower of the Buddha, as well as Ajatashatru. And particularly, if we think about the time of King Ajatashatru, and during the latter part of the Buddha's life, the king of Magadha was Ajatashatru. Now, according to the Sri Lankan histories, it was in the 8th year of Ajatashatru's reign that the Buddha passed into parinirvana. So how did Ajatashatru gain power? It's actually a rather bad way they did that. Ajatashatru actually killed his father Bimbisara and took power and then reigned. Now, the way that he took power was bad, but when he ruled, he actually ruled very wisely and very capably. And in particular, he was able to take power over Kosala, which is a rather large country. As I mentioned before, there were 16 great countries, and among them Kosala was one, and its capital was in Shravasta. So actually, they moved the capital a couple times, but there's mainly in Shravasti. Now, during the time of the Buddha, the king of Kosala was King Prasenajit. And this is a name that we also see frequently in the Buddhist canon. Now, there was a war between King Prasenajit and Ajatashatru. And in the end, there was this prince Viruddhaka. And so after the death of the prince Viruddhaka, then Magadha was able to gain power, to take control over the region of Kosala. And so Ajatashatru was able to gain control over Kosala. Another country he was able to gain power over was Vatsa. So this was another one of the 16 great countries. And I was now at that time, it was one of the larger countries in northern India. We also speak about Kaushambi, right? This place of Kaushambi was actually the capital of the country of Vatsa. So Kaushambi, it's a name that we see often in the Buddhist canon, right? And so in the ancient times, It was one of the six largest cities in India. So it was one of the larger cities in India during the time of the Buddha. The king of Udayana was Vatsa was Udayana. So the Udayana also fought wars against Ajatashatru, as well as he fought also wars against the king of the kingdom of Avanti, Pradyota the Cruel. In any case, during the time of Ajatashatru, he was able to gain control over Kosala and Vatsa, as well as many other kingdoms. Now, after the death of Ajatashatru, and according to the Buddhist histories, as well as according to the Jain histories, Ajatashatru's son, Udayin, so Udayin took power, and he moved the capital of Magadha and he moved the capital where he moved the capital to was Pataliputra. So this is present-day Patna. This is the capital of the state of Bihar. So Patna is the largest city in Bihar. So in ancient times, it was called Pataliputra. So he moved the capital and then reigned from there. And after him, according to the Buddhist histories, he was succeeded by the king Anuruddha, and then King Munda, and after him, Darshaka, and then Nagadasaka. There are several kings after him. So I shall show you the names of these kings. And so it's Bimbisara, then Ajatashatru, Udayin, Anuruddha, Munda, Darshaka, and then Nagadasaka. So the last of them was the Nagadasaka. So this is the king Nagadasaka. In any case, it remained for several generations of kings. So this is the Haryanka dynasty. Following that, there was another dynasty, as a new dynasty began. And the name of this is the Shusanaga dynasty. So this is the Shusanaga dynasty, alternately known as the Sheshanaga or the Shishunaga. Now, the way the Shushanaga dynasty began is that there was the last king of the Haryanka dynasty was Nagadasaka, as I had mentioned before. So during his time, many of the residents of the cities rebelled against the king. And they overthrew the Haryanka dynasty, and they gained control over the throne. And at that point, the minister Shishunaga was selected. He was voted for by the residents and enthroned, and so he started a new dynasty. Now, so a question, who Shushanaga was, and we wonder what his birthplace and caste are and family are. It's very difficult, actually. It's complex. His father was a soldier. His mother was an artist. And he seemed to be from a line of noble people, noblemen from the Chavi. And this new dynasty was called by many names. The Shushanaga was sometimes called by many different names. Sometimes called the Shushanaga, the Shishunaga, or the Lichavi dynasty. So it was given many different names. Later, the Shisanaga kings gained control over the powerful Western Indian kingdom of Avanti. And so it's called probably in Tibetan, it's called Sungche. Now, as I mentioned before, this is one of the 16 great countries, and the capital of this is the capital of Ujjaini. So it's Ujjaini in Pali, Ujjayini. So Ujjaini or Ujjayini. And there's also in the common language it's called Avantipuri in the colloquial language, which is like the city of Avanti. But in any case, the Shushanaga dynasty also took power over the powerful West Indian country of Avanti. They also conquered the kingdom of Vatsa. Now, of course, another explanation is that the last of there are the Haryanka kings. I said before the Shusanaga kings, there was the Haryanka dynasty, right? The last king of the Haryanka dynasty, Nagadasaka, took power over the country of Vatsa. And another explanation is that before the Shisanagas, the last king, in any case, there was a period of many years. There were many conflicts over years, and from the time that the Paurava countries there is many years of conflict between the two countries. It was finally during the Shisanaga dynasty that they were able to take control and then bring an end to the disputes. So the kings of Shisanagas, the kings who followed them were, according to the Sri Lankan history called the Dipavamsa, it says that followed by the Shusanaga, the next king was called Kala-shoka. So the first king was Shusanaga, the second was Kala-shoka. You could call him about as you may be called the artistic Ashoka. Now, in ancient India, there's an ancient Indian topic called the Puranas, and according to the Puranas, it's also called the crow armor Kakavana, as it said. So there are different names, but actually it's probably the same person, it is said. In any case, so that Kala-shoka, according to became a very important king during the Buddhist history, because it's during this time that Vaishali, that the second council was held in the city of Vaishali. Now some Tibetan historians have confused this king Kala-shoka with the Dharma king Ashoka. And they say that the second council that was held under Kala-shoka was actually held under the king Ashoka. But this is something that we'll speak about later when we discuss the second Buddhist council. And anyways, according to the Dipavamsa, or the Mahavamsa, Kala-shoka had 9 or 10 sons, and they all ruled simultaneous, they say. So if you look at this again, and so this is the first in the Shusanaga dynasty. The first is Shusanaga, the second is Kala-shoka, and here we have either 9 or 10, it says. In particular, in the Sri Lankas, it says is that they had 10 sons. And their names, if they reigned they reign simultaneous. And so if they reign simultaneous, you can't say which years they reigned in. In any case, the Shushanaga dynasty, as it continued, what appeared after was another dynasty, which is called the Nanda dynasty. The Nanda dynasty, as explained, is according to that the king called Harsha-Charita during the. So this is the Harsha-Charita is a 7th century Indian text, and it says that during this time, so that during the time, this is actually Harsha-Charita was a very well-known a person, and he, during the time that the Tang Xuanzang of the Tang dynasty traveled there, he met the king Harsha-Charita. Anyways, he spoke about the story of this, and so this is the and the text that's based upon, or the source is based on, is that in this text, someone slit the throat of Kala Ashoka, and he died after. And then the assassin himself became the founder king of the Nanda dynasty. So this is how it is described in the text titled the Harsha-Charita. But there's a 4th century text called the Puranas. This is an ancient history. It's a very ancient Indian history, and so this is a general name. Actually, there are many Puranas. It seems actually there are many historical texts there, but during the 4th century text called the Purana, what it says is that the name of the first king of the Nanda dynasty was Mahapadmananda. And so this is what it says there. But according to Ceylon, which is that means Sri Lanka. So according to the great Ceylonese history, the Mahavamsa, but it says in the Sri Lanka, it says that there are 9 kings in the Nanda dynasty. So this is according to the Mahavamsa, and according to the Vamsa, during the king of the Nanda dynasty, there were 9 kings, and they were all brothers. So they were all brothers, and they took turns reigning for the duration of 22 years, over the course of 22 years. And among them, the first of them was Ugrasena, and the last name was Dhanananda. So this means someone who likes jewels. So Dhanananda. So the last king of the Nanda dynasty, Dhanananda, the time that of his reign was during the period of the Greek king Alexander the Great's invasion. So the Greek king Alexander invaded India, and during that time, the king of Magadha was King Dhanananda. There's one explanation. Now, generally, the Nanda dynasty was actually very military powerful, and it has pretty powerful economically as well. But in terms of how they governed, they weren't very good. And so the people didn't really like the Nanda kings very much. And so for this reason, later, when the first king of the Maurya dynasty, Chandragupta, seized power from the Nandas, he didn't have too many difficulties. It's actually very easy for him to take power, according to the historians. So that's a basic introduction to the Nanda dynasty. Following them was the Maurya dynasty, the Peacock dynasty. When you speak about the Maurya dynasty, this in 326 BC, the great king Alexander the Great invaded northwest India. He invaded northern India, but his armies were not able to reach central India. Alexander then died in 323 BC in Babylon. And because of his death, the invasion was unable to press further into central India because the king himself had died. Alexander himself died, so they were unable to invade further into India. So, taking advantage of the Greek invasion, then Chandragupta, if we translate, so the Chandragupta means hidden moon. So this young youth, Chandragupta, with the assistance of a minister named Chanakya, some people say that he's a Brahmin Chanakya. In any case, he was like a minister of the king. He was an advisor to the king. So that was his job or a role. And his another name that he is known by is Kautilya. So Chanakya was very, very skillful, and so he was able to help Chandragupta, and they toppled the Nanda dynasty and they established the Maurya dynasty. So the first king of the Maurya dynasty was this Chandragupta. Actually, this great minister Chanakya, or because it's sometimes said the Rishi Chanakya. So in Tibetan translation, sometimes he's called Chanaka. He wrote actually a very well-known text. It's called the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra probably means the treatise on goals. And the main topic of this text is it's about how to govern, how to rule a kingdom. So it's a treatise discussing this. And so these are what we talk about is in Tibetan they're called treatises on the ways of kings, like the text written by Jim Mipam Rinpoche. So basically, this is a text on how to rule a kingdom. And this text has both a root text as well as a commentary. And the root text was translated into Tibetan, and it is included in the Tenjura in the section on the crafts. Now, many historians say that both the root text and the commentary are by the same author, Chanakya. But there are some people who say that they weren't written by the same person. In any case, this is a very well-known text. In any case, so the advisor is Chanakya, and the person who is inspiring was the king Chandragupta, and they worked together. And starting with northwest India, they eliminated the Greek influence, the Greek power, and gained control over most of India and established a powerful empire. So Chandragupta reigned for 24 years, it is said. And his son was called Bindusara. Bindusara reigned for 28 years. And following him, it was the Emperor Ashoka, the Dharma King Ashoka. And he ascended to the throne in 268 BC. So the Emperor Ashoka, or the Dharma King Ashoka, ascended in 268 BCE. If I show you again, so this is the Maurya dynasty. The first king was Chandragupta, the second was Bindusara, and the third was Ashoka. There's more to say about this, but we don't need to speak about it all right now. Later, when I speak about Ashoka, I will say more. Now, there's one problem here, though. So after the Buddha passed away, in other words, after the Buddha died, if we don't speak about it in polite terms, between the time when the Buddha is parinirvana and Ashoka, then there's a problem here. There are many different assertions about how long that period lasted. Now, some people say there are mainly two different regions, according to the Buddhist history. Now, there are two accounts. The first one is the Sri Lankan histories. And what it says in those Sri Lankan histories is that between the parinirvana of the Buddha and Ashoka ascending to the throne, and there are 218 years, it is said. Now, according to Northern Buddhist histories, these are the scriptures preserved primarily in Chinese translation. So the Northern Buddhist histories are primarily the scriptures in the Chinese translation, as it is said. And according to the accounts there, most of them say that it's just a bit over 100 years, but not 200 years. So between the parinirvana of the Buddha up to Ashoka's ascension to the throne, there were just over 100 years. Now, there are some other political histories, but there are many internal contradictions in many of them. Because there's so many internal contradictions, it's difficult to find reliable evidence. When we speak, there are a lot of disputes about the dates of the different dynasties and kings' names. And so we'll leave them for now. So later, if we have time to speak about the date of the parinirvana of the Buddha, then we'll speak about that more. We don't need to say too much about it today. So following this, I'd like to speak about primarily using the Sri Lankan basis, the Sri Lankan text as a basis, as we talk about what happened to the Buddhist Sangha and how the Sangha developed during the time between the parinirvana and the ascension of Ashoka to the throne. So, after the Buddha's parinirvana, what was the sort of general progression, the progression of the spread of Buddhism? The first thing that we have to understand is we need to understand the four sacred sites of the Buddhist. Now, if we talk about the four sacred sites, according to some scholars, we say that there's the Buddhist Sangha. And we talk about the Buddhist Sangha, if you include so there's the Buddhist Sangha, and so they said that you can also include the lay community in the Buddhist Sangha, but in that case, the Buddhist Sangha primarily meant the Buddhist Sangha. So some researchers say that the Buddhist Sangha initially, after the Buddha's parinirvana, the primary area that it spread was in some regions in the central India.
상계 양에는 대베제게 어느 난데 대베제선 나보 상계에 대바디 간저스 답에 총발에 되게 캡션 간저지가 토안에 안에 답에 총발에 시제.
Next, I'd like to speak about the progression of the development of Buddhism after the parinirvana of the Buddha. So the first thing we just speak about in regard to this is that according to some scholars, the Sangha of the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist Sangha here, if we want to talk about the Buddhist Sangha generally, includes is understood to mean the community of the monastics, but it can be also understood to mean the lay community, but it primarily means the monastic community. So after the Buddha's parinirvana, the Buddhist Sangha spread mainly to the main region it spread to was some regions in central India. It had not spread to many other regions, they say. So there are some scholars who assert this. And we say that it spread in central India. So to determine what that means we have to speak about the four sacred sites, because after the Buddha passed away, there were people who wanted to go on pilgrimages to these sites where the Buddha had been, and in order to recall the Buddha and to celebrate the Buddha. Now, of course, we talk about the 8 great sites or the 4 great sites, sacred sites. There are many different lists of these, but in general, it seems that we consider the 4 sacred sites to be the more important list. And so these 4 sites are when we speak about the 4 sacred sites of Buddhism, is the birthplace of the Buddha in Lumbini, the site of his parinirvana, Kushinagar, and these 2 are in the northern edge of the central regions of the Indian subcontinent. So they're basically in the northern part of that, right? So Lumbini and Kushinagar are in the northern regions. They're basically at the northern borders of the central region. Then the site of the Buddha's enlightenment is more like in the southern parts of central India. So it's down towards the southern region, and the place where he first turned the wheel of Dharma is more in the west of the central regions. So these 4 places are what we call the 4 Buddhist sacred sites. Now, sometimes we also call them the 4 Chaitya, the 4 stupas. So in these 4 great sites, they built 4 stupas, and so for that reason, they're also called the 4 great stupas. But in generally, they're called the 4 sacred sites. Now, these 4 sacred sites, after the Buddha's parinirvana, became places where the Buddhists would go on pilgrimage. So this tradition gradually developed and spread. And so for this reason, the region where these 4 sacred sites are, in terms of really design, are what we'd call the geographically would be the central country. So in terms of the Dharma there, we could say that in terms of the Dharma, they are the central land. So excuse me, that wasn't right there. I wrote geographically. So they were the central lands in terms of the Dharma. And of course, not only were they geographically central India, but also in terms of the Dharma, they were also they're like the hub of the Buddhist teaching, the place where the Buddhist teachings had spread. It's the area where the sacred sites of Buddhism were, and so it's considered in terms of the Dharma, is also considered a central land. Now, in general, when we speak about the meaning of the central land, there are many characteristics, such as having all four communities and so forth. So it's going to be say that for it to be a central land, it has to have the fourfold community. But at that time, the central land meant primarily the areas where the Buddha had spread were the great sacred sites and the region around them. So the places where people went on their pilgrimages, we can estimate. Now, following this, it is said that the Buddhism had spread to the southern regions of India. The reason why it said this is that actually that after the Buddhist parinirvana, the Buddhist Sangha continued to spread to the west of India and to the southwest. Now, the reason why the Buddhism spread to these regions is primarily that, said to the south of central India, there's the Vindhya mountain range. So the name of this in Sanskrit is called the Vindhya mountain range. So it's a mountain range. And to go to the south of it, it was kind of blocked by the mountain range, so it's not so easy to travel to the south. One wanted to travel to the east. The east was a place where the temperatures are very high. And it was an area where there's not a great population, so it's not very easy to travel there either. So for this reason, people primarily studied. It was difficult to travel you couldn't go to the south or the east, and not to say that you couldn't, but it was very difficult. And so for this reason, the early Buddhist Sangha gradually spread to the west and to the southwest. And among these two, the spread to the west actually took a little bit longer. And the reason that it took a little bit longer is possibly that at that time, the western regions were areas where the Brahmanical religions were very strong. And it was a little difficult for Buddhism to spread to regions where the Brahmanical religion was very strong, or it took a longer time to spread there. Yeah, this is one explanation. Now, when you say that it spread to the southwest, the spread to the southwest, what some scholars say is that some scholars say that not only did Buddhism spread to the southwest after the Buddhist parinirvana, but it did begin to spread there also during the lifetime of the Buddha. And the reason why they say this is that the Buddha had 10 great disciples. So these are what we talk about we often talk about the 8 great disciples, but also in the Theravada tradition, also in the northern tradition, they say that the Buddha had 10 great disciples. So in the Tibetan tradition, we don't use this term. But in any case, in the Theravada tradition and in Chinese Buddhism, they say that there are 10 great disciples, and one of them was Mahakaccana, or Mahakatyayana. Mahakatyayana. So in Sanskrit, Mahakatyayana. Now, the place where he was born was in the kingdom of Avanti. I mentioned the kingdom of Avanti, one of the 16 great countries, right? And as I mentioned before, the capital of that is the city of Ujjaini. So it's called Patge in Tibetan. In any case, now after among all of the different great disciples, Mahakatyayana was very good at elaborating and explaining on simple Dharma teachings. This is why he is considered one of the 10 great disciples. And after he had listened and studied all the Dharma teachings and achieved the state of arhatship, he returned to his homeland of Avanti and taught the Dharma to the people of that area. Now, in the Tibetan tradition, this is described in great detail in the finer points, chapters on the finer points of discipline in the Tibetan tradition. Now, he had one disciple. After he went to Avanti, one of his students, so a student went forth, became adorned, and what his name was Sona Kutikana. So his name is Kutikana, Sona Kutikana. So his name is Sona Kutikana. So Sona Kutikana traveled a very long way to go to see the Buddha in Shravasti. He traveled from Avanti for a very long distance to go. It's quite a long distance to go see the Buddha in Shravasti. And so his abbot, Mahakatyayana, knew that he was traveling to see the Buddha. And so he asked Sonakotiti to ask the 5 questions that Katyayana had about the Vinaya. And so he sent that message with these 5 questions. Now, these are now in the central regions of India. In central India, the Sangha was not permitted to wear clothes made out of leather, but in the region of Avanti, where Katyayana was here, it was a bit higher elevation, so people did wear skins and leather, and so there was questions about whether it was permissible to wear leather and so forth. In any case, he sent these 5 questions with Sona Kutikana to ask the Buddha. In any case, Sona Kutikana went to see. So Sona Kutikana went to see the Buddha, and Sona Kutikana himself was born in the region of Aparanta. So Aparanta means west coast. So he was born in this area called West Coast. It's basically on the west coast of India. And so it's basically the western region, the western border, the western coast of India. This is where he's born. And I'd mentioned that is even further west than Avanti, the place where Katyayana had been born. So it's even further west than its capital, Ujjaini. And so Sona Kutikana was from that So there's a story that Sona Kutikana was from that country, Katyayana was that country, and spread the Dharma. And so there's basically stories that the Dharma spread to the west, and in fact to the west coast of India during the Buddha's lifetime. So there are some researchers do explain this. Now, it's in the Theravada tradition that it is said that Sona Kutikana is said to be the main disciple of Katyayana. And the chapter on leather in the Tibetan translations also says that he is the Katyayana's disciple. However, in the Mahasanghika Vinaya says that Sona Kutikana was not Katyayana's disciple, but Purana's. So Purana, Purana was another important disciple of the Buddha. And Purana's birthplace was in the city of Suparaka. So he was born in the city of Suparaka. And Suparaka is also called by the name of Sopara. And so Sopara was also on the coast. So basically on the west coast of India near the ocean. And the area of this called... Now, they have also found an Ashokan rock inscription in that region where this place is, and just a little bit north of Mumbai, and you could arrive at that place. And so Purana, after he achieved Arhatship, he returned to his homeland and taught the Dharma and converted many students, according to some histories. And so this also shows that likely the Buddhism had spread to a fair degree on the West Coast during the Buddha's lifetime. And so, as I was saying before, if we take it according to the Theravada tradition and the Mulasarvastivada tradition, then he's the disciple of Katyayana disciple, and he spread the so Katyayana spread the Dharma in the west of India, and also his student Sona Kutikana also spread the Dharma all the way as far as the west coast. And so for this reason, we can say that the Buddhism shows that Buddha had spread to the west coast of India. Or another one, according to the Mahasanghika view, is Purana, who was born by the west coast of India, and after he achieved Arhatship, he once returned to that area and taught the Dharma. And so this region is also described there. And so if you take it in those terms, it shows that the Buddha had spread to the west coast of India during the Buddha's lifetime. But another one is another explanation that the Buddhism has spread from central regions down to the south, and that the reason for that this is said that it's not so easy to go to the south because you have the Vindhya mountain range. So going from the central India down to the south of India, as it is said. However, but there are accounts of Buddha spreading to the south. Now, where this is said is in the section of the sutras, the Sutta Nipaya of the Theravada tradition. So in the Sutta Nikaya, there was there's a 5 different in the minor discourses. There are 5 different sets of discourses. So in the section of sutras, there are 5 different sections, and the last of them is the chapter on the way to the far shore. And so this has at the beginning, that's the basic verses, it says. So this is the basic, the background story and verse. And within this, it describes that there is near the region called the Dakshina Mountain, there is a Godavari River. This is the second longest river in India. The longest is the Ganges, and the second is the Godavari. So it's the second longest river. So there's a Buddha who lived near the upper reaches of the Godavari River. He's named Bhavari. So he heard of the fame of the Buddha. He didn't actually meet the Buddha in person, but he heard that the Buddha was very famous. And so he sent 16 students to study the Dharma with him. When he sent these students, they left the regions near the upper reaches of from the city called Pratishtana or Paitan. So they left that region and they traveled along the southern road for Ujjaini, Vidisha, Kaushambi, and Shakya, and through many different areas. And eventually they arrived in Shravasti to see the Buddha. So this is described in this text from the Theravada tradition, the chapter on the way to the far shore. In any case, these 16 students of the Brahman Bhavari went to when the 16 students went to see the Buddha, the path that they followed, to show you on the map, so here, it's a very long, very difficult for them. So in the bottom we have Mumbai, right? So this is near the upper reaches of the Godavari River. This is the city of Pratishtana. So Pratishtana is there. So started from Pratishtana. Well, there are a lot of different. They had to go a very long way around, and in the end, they finally came to Shravasti. They came to the kingdom of Kosala. Oh, they eventually came to Kolkata. And so they took they had a very long way. It's a hard trip. Going from the southern regions was very difficult. In any case, these Brahman Bhavari sent his 16 students to see the Buddha. And they met the Buddha, and they had asked many questions of the Buddha, and he responded. And so the questions and answers are recorded in this chapter on the way to the far shore. The chapter on the way to the far shore is in a very ancient form of Pali. So it's a very old, especially grammatically, and it probably dates from the same time as the Octet chapter of the section of sutras. So this Octet chapter is so many scholars say that these two, the chapter on the way to the far shore and the Octet chapter, developed at the same time. So in this way, it can be considered among the earliest works in the four agamas. So this is the earliest one of the earliest works. However, some scholars do have some doubts about this, and the reason why they doubt it is that the grammar may be very old, but when it's compared to when he says that the grammar is old, the language is older. So even though it's an ancient language, when you compare to the rock inscriptions of Ashoka, it's really difficult to say which is more ancient, whether the inscriptions on the rock inscriptions or whether it is the chapter on the way to the far shore. It's difficult to decide. So therefore, they say it is a bit far-fetched to say, based merely on the ancient grammar, that the chapter on the way of the far shore was composed during the Buddhist lifetime. So there are some scholars who say this. Now, the discussion of the 16 students traveling to Shravasti were recorded the introductory verses to the chapter on the way to the foreshore. They're like the background story or the introductory verses. So these introductory verses or the verses on the background story seem to have been written at a later time than the actual verses in the chapter on the way to the far shore. The reason for this is so the introductory verses were written later, but the actual main part of the text appeared earlier, they say. And so for this reason, these introductory verses the contents of these introductory verses are not really enough evidence to decide whether the Buddha's fame had spread to the Deccan regions of southern India during his lifetime. It's not enough of a reason, they say, according to some scholars. In any case, because of these stories or these accounts, there are these accounts of this, and in brief, the Sangha first spread into the southwest region, and one example of that, one clear example of this is that Ashoka's son Mahindra was born. So his birthplace was in Ujjaini, which is the same place as Mahakatyayana. So he was from the same place as Katyayana. And Mahindra, or the Dharma that Mahindra brought to Sri Lanka. So Mahindra spread the Dharma to Sri Lanka, as it is said. And the Dharma that he brought there is in the Pali language. So these days, the scholars, when they compare the inscriptions on Ashoka's or the rock inscriptions and the pillars of Ashoka, and they combine this to the Pali language. The Pali language, if you say, is actually the Pali language is on the Akatiyawar Peninsula. There are rock inscriptions in an area called Ginar. And so it's very close to the language. Pali is very close to the language used on these rock edicts in Ginar. So based on this, we can know that during the time of Ashoka, Dharma had already spread widely there. So that is that discussion. So next, I would like to speak about, how shall I say it? There are some dissensions, and then later they're split into different schools, and so there's a historical background for that. So I'd like to give an introduction to the difficulties in the Sangha at that point. And so there's a Japanese scholar named Umada Gyoke, and according to him, as I was just explaining, during the 100 or 200 years, over 100 or 200 years following the Buddha's parinirvana, there were many changes in the Indian political environment. There are many different dynasties, as I have explained. So the time of the Buddha's nirvana, the king was Ajatashatru in Magadha, that is, and then later there's the Shishunaga kings, and then there are the Nanda king the dynasty, and then following that there was the Maurya dynasty, and so there had been many dynasties. And then finally and so if we get up to the time of Ashoka, there had been many generations. Likewise, during this time, the Buddhism and the Sangha had spread to a fair extent already during this period. So when you think about it, if we think about it carefully, actually, 102 years is actually a rather long time. And a lot of changes can happen in that time frame. For example, if we think about it, if we look back at the 18th or the 19th centuries, when you think about these, would you think about the 18th, 19th centuries? I think that really long time ago, I think very early. And we feel like there's a lot of time has passed between these two times. If we talk about 100 or 200 years, people think like it's a long time ago. So if we're thinking about the period of 100 or 200 years, within the Buddhist Sangha, there may have well been many changes. Likewise, there have been many difficulties and disputes, and also many may have many problems, and there may have been more disagreements than before. The changes in the disagreements within the Buddhist Sangha are probably not just in one area, but probably in many different areas. In terms of the view, the conduct, and many different areas, there are probably disagreements we can assume. In the very end, what happened is that this led to the split into different schools. The Sangha, it ended up that the Sangha had to split into two different schools. In any case, so this is what this Japanese scholar Umada Gyoke says. So next, what I'd like to speak about is I'm thinking about the time the period leading up to the Second Council and the split into different schools. We're talking about the changes in the Buddhist Sangha and then the situation and the disagreements that arose within the Buddhist Sangha during that time. Now, like for any religion, we have to think about what does a religion need in order to survive? For any religion, if a religion needs to remain and flourish in the world, what are the conditions they need? The first thing that you need is you have to have a teacher. You need to have the teacher of that religion. And then you also need the religion that teacher taught. And those two are not enough. You also need to have followers of that religion. If there are no followers of that religion, then that religion isn't there. So you have to have the religion, the teacher, the religion they taught, and the followers of the religion. These are the three conditions that you need, that must be there. And so in Buddhism, these are represented by the teacher. The teacher as the Buddha, that the religion he taught is the Dharma, the true Dharma. And the followers of the Sangha are the followers of the Dharma are the Sangha. So these are what we call the three jewels. So it's like the foundation of the Buddhist teachings are these three jewels. Now, these three jewels are actually dependent upon each other. The jewel of the Buddha is the teacher of the Buddha. So, like if you think like he's the basis or the foundation, the foundation of the three jewels is the Buddha, is the jewel of the Buddha, and the Dharma is actually beyond the sphere of the Buddha. It's actually some things like the character of the Buddha's wisdom, or it says the Buddha's prajna and his particular prajna. This is the primary topic of the Buddha's teachings, the character of the Buddha, and the prajna of the Buddha is omniscient wisdom, you could say. Or you could see about the prajna that could discriminate the four truths. And the reason, and so the topic of the teachings is primarily what is the character of the Buddha, what is the wisdom that he has, the wisdom or the prajna that he has that others don't have. And so that is why you have the teachings. Because you have a Buddha such as this, then the Sangha also can have like a real meaning and a real purpose. If there's no Buddha, then there's no particular meaning or essence point for the Sangha. And because the Buddha had such wisdom and so forth, then we can say that the source of the Buddha is like the source of our effects. We can say that say that we have a foundation or an origin for our Buddhas. And if we all think about it, he's like an aim for the teachings. It's like it's by practicing the Buddhism that I can become like the Buddha. It's like he's like someone who we can take as an example. However, the Buddha himself passed into parinirvana. And after he had passed away, then, so whatever you think about it, it's the way people are, actually. When someone's alive, you don't really think about them too much. But when that person has passed away, then everyone wants to remember them and commemorate them. People really miss them. And so after the Buddha passed away, then many people think that the Buddha was such a great being, such an important being. If they wanted to kind of have some solace or some sort of commemorate the Buddha, they wanted to have reminders of the Buddha. And since they couldn't see the Buddha in person anymore, the main source for this was the places where the Buddha's relics and the places where the Buddha had traveled or where he had stayed, and in particular, the teachings that the Buddha himself had left behind, the instructions on the Dharma. So these were the primary reminders of the Buddha. In particular, in the Buddha, in the testament that he left, he told the students that in the future that the students could consider the Dharma and the Vinaya as their teacher. Now, usually we say it's you take the Vinaya as their teacher. Now, I think that there's another account where it says that you should consider the Dharma and the Vinaya as the teacher. In any case, it's basically the Dharma that the Buddha had taught that people should consider their teachers. And so after the Buddha's parinirvana, the primary focus, the basis thing that they remembered was the Dharma. So when the Buddha was no longer with us, then the Dharma itself became our primary source and place where we place our hopes. And so the Dharma and how to practice the Dharma and what should we do to practice the Dharma, it became like the most important question. This became the most important issue. So after the Buddha had passed away, then among the Buddhist religion, there were many difficulties that Buddhism faced. And so what these difficulties included were the difficulties that Buddhism encountered after the parinirvana were how to continue practicing and attain enlightenment. How do we practice the Dharma? How can we achieve enlightenment? The second is that in the Buddhist teachings, there are some areas of the philosophy that seem still incomplete. Now, this is scholars, academics explanation. So basically, during his lifetime, the Buddha primarily emphasized practice. And you could say they didn't take so much interest in philosophy, or he didn't emphasize philosophy so much. So he would teach according to the time and the person, according to the abilities, the capabilities of people's teaching. So he taught in ways that are easy to practice. But so there were areas for philosophical presentation, but there are some areas. For example, to think about the Kagyu forefathers, if you look at their teachings, there are many different they taught in ways that are easy to understand and put into practice, but there are areas where they didn't have such a complete presentation of the philosophies. So it's that way with the Buddhist teaching, with the Buddha's teachings in terms of the philosophical presentation or the logical presentation. And basically, to say, because what we usually talk about it is the way it's discussed in the great texts. And so because there were these were incomplete, they had to be filled in. Now, the third point is if people had questions about the Buddha's wisdom or the power of the Buddha or the nirvana, so if someone had a doubt about this or a question about them, how should you answer them? Someone might ask, did the Buddha's wisdom disappear? Or is the Buddha's power limited? Or is the Buddha's power unlimited? So if someone asks you this, how do you answer them? The fourth question is that if there are disagreements or criticism from non-Buddhists, or if there are internal disagreements among Buddhists, how do you respond to these? So there are these many different areas and many different issues, many difficulties that the Buddhism encountered. When we say these are issues or criticism, they're areas that they had to pay attention to or had to face. The main point is that after the Buddha's parinirvana, this Buddha's followers really missed the Buddha. And they had a great longing to see the Buddha, but they were no longer able to see the actual Buddha. Because they were unable to see that, their faith and interest in the Buddha's teachings grew greater. But at that time, so one's own weakness, you could say, is that the Buddhist Sangha at the past, there was the teacher. There was like a supreme teacher, a supreme leader, you could say. And it was not that difficult because he was there. But after, when the Buddha was no longer present, it was, say, the great disciples who had to be the leaders of the Sangha. And so the Sangha community was no longer as unified as before, and there was no longer the same, and since there was no leading figure, it didn't have as much a unanimity as it did during the time of the Buddha. It's like a question of the the harmony and the unity of the Sangha was lost. In addition to that, the Sangha was spreading geographically, and as it was spreading, getting larger, there was a split into different regions. So the Sangha was spread out, scattered over a larger area, and because of long distance between these different regions. And in particular, at that time, communication and sending less messages was not easy at all. Likewise, each area had different customs and different traditions. And so for this reason, the community of the Buddhist Sangha even had developed some of the attitudes, philosophies, and even in the robes and clothing of the Buddhist Sangha. Likewise, they also developed different understandings of the intent of the Buddha's teachings. So they had different ways of understanding, so their view and philosophy was different, their feeling was a little bit different, their attitudes are different, their robes are different. So these are these are the differences that happen, and when differences happen, there's a question of difficulty of whether they're going to accept each other's differences. And so naturally, there's like it was moving in the direction of splitting into different schools and different communities as Buddhism spread. So it's just naturally occurred. It's like there's no alternative but it split to move in that direction. So what were the areas of differences of view, or what were the greatest areas or what were the sort of hidden circumstances that might show the differences in the Sangha? In order to know that, we need to think about the character of the Sangha at that time, or the attitudes, or we think about the different types of characters or attitudes in the Sangha. This is something we need to understand first. So one thing we need to understand is that, first of all, during the time of the First Council, at the end of the First Council, they had the First Council, and after the First Council was finished, and was concluded well, and because of it was successful. What this shows is that this is the elder Mahakashyapa. So if you could say so basically the Mahakashypa's basic project of unifying the Sangha had been successful. The person who decided that they should, or who said that they should have a first council was Mahakashyapa, and most people supported him. There may have been one or two, there probably were one or two people who didn't support, but most everyone supported him. And according to their support, the first council was held, it was successful, and because of this, Mahakashyapa and his faction, you could say, their project of unifying the Sangha was accomplished successfully. Because that worked out well, then the different factions, you could say, or the people who had different ideas, basically quieted down. Because his project worked out well, and so there are people who just didn't feel like they could really say much about it. Now, Mahakashyapa was the type of person if you think about it, the place that he was born into a non-Buddhist Brahmin family who was rich, and for many years, he was actually rather old already by the time he became Buddhist. So for many years, he primarily followed non-Buddhist Hindu practices. Later, when he was already an advanced age, he became a student of the Buddhas and became an important Buddha. And after he became the Buddhist student, you could say whether it's the imprints or habits from practicing the Brahmanical religions, he followed the qualities of trainings, and he adhered to them very strongly. So the austerities in Buddhism were not like the austerities followed in the Jain or the Hindu religions, but in any case, at that time we spoke about the qualities of training. And so he was someone who practiced a more austere form of Buddhism, and he was very well known for that. And at that time, what contemporary scholars say is that Kashyapa was also rather conservative. So if you'd say if it less kind of, he's like sort of the people more inflexible views. He likes that you just follow the old traditions and just do exactly that. And so he was of that type of a person. So it wasn't only Mahakashyapa who was more conservative. There are actually three different factions at that time. So among these three different factions, and the first was Usung Mahakashyapa, who was in a more conservative view. So and then there are three different ones, different views, and the first of these were a faction of people who were even more conservative than Mahakashyapa and his followers. And so these include people such as Elder Purana. Now, the reason why we say that they're even more conservative than Kashyapa and his faction is that what Purana said is that every single rule the Buddha made must be strictly followed without allowing any relaxation at all. And so for that reason, we'd say that the elder Purana is among the Sangha community at that time, is probably among the most conservative, the ultra-conservative faction. The second group was the somewhat more liberal faction. So basically, in comparison, this is the more liberal group, and it's represented by Ananda. And what Ananda said is that the Buddhist Sangha should follow the middle way. Generally the livelihood of the Buddha is avoiding is giving up the extremes of austerities and giving up the extreme of luxuries. It's following the middle path. And since the Buddha taught that the Sangha must follow the middle way, so that this is the basic thing, and so that some of the minor or subtle precepts may be practiced according to the time and place, or they may be relaxed according to time and place. So this is the second group. The third group is included people such as Vaspa, one of the 5 first disciples of the Buddha. And they were even more liberal than Ananda's faction. So they're even more liberal than Navadi because you can do what you want, basically. So you could relax the disciples. There's no need to be so hard-headed about it, be so inflexible about it. And so one could say that these were probably the predecessors to the Mahasangika school. So Vaspa can be considered as one of the originators of the Mahasangika school. So they had a more liberal view. Now, the reason why we need to say this is that later when we speak about the split into the main schools, the reason why the schools had to split is that after the Parinirvana of the Buddha, there developed to be sort of different ways of interpreting. There are different ways that people developed in the Buddhist Sangha. So we have these three factions. If you include Mahakashyapa's faction, then you have four different factions. And so if we have these four different factions, then all these factions in actuality were trying to do their best to follow the intent of the Buddha's teachings, the Vinaya discipline. None of them said that they were going against the Buddha's instructions. But they were a little bit different in their viewpoints and in their methods. But they were all the same in wanting to follow the trainings and the Vinaya discipline. They weren't saying that they should all be discarded. But among them, there were two that would be considered conservative, and there are two that could be considered more liberal. And so among these two, the first two, which would say the first was the elder Purana's faction. The second is Kashyapa's. And so these two basically became the Mahakashyapa's faction. And so these both ended up becoming the conservative factions of the third and the fourth. The third was Ananda's, and the fourth, excuse me, I mixed that up. The first and second, the first is Mahakashyapa's. The second is Purana, is Elder Purana. And so these two together represent the conservative factions, and the third and the fourth. The third is Ananda's faction, and the fourth is Vaspa's faction. And these two were the more liberal factions. But later, Ananda's side gradually sort of began to support Mahakashyapa. Now, I'll speak about this later. So next, there's also that there are many new issues that developed within the Vinaya. So as I mentioned before, when the Buddha taught that when we practice the Dharma, we need to follow the middle way. And we can't follow either extreme. We can't go too far to the right or to the left. Instead of following the left, veering to the right or left, we need to follow the middle way path. The Buddha said that the Buddha emphasized that we need to maintain the middle way and practice that. Likewise, the Buddha said that aside from the root precepts, the minor precepts, you can say the finer points of Buddhist discipline, the very small ones, the ones that the one that don't have much point, according to the place and the time and the place and the situation, if you could look at those and then relax them if necessary, you can do it simply. The Buddha did say this. The main point is that the Buddha said that if you need to think about the physical and mental situation of all sentient beings, or in terms of their meditation practice, and if it doesn't harm these, then it was probably fine to relax the discipline. Now, the reason to say this is in order to preserve the stability of the Vinaya overall, and to allow people to pick and choose with the minor disciplines according to what makes it skillful to practice the everyday livelihood. And so when the Buddha was about to pass to nirvana, he specifically told Ananda, and so this is in the Buddha Matraka Sutra. Excuse me, the Vinaya Matraka Sutra. And what it says is, after my nirvana, this is just a very preliminary translation. I'm not sure if it makes it 100% matches it. But after my nirvana, the Sangha should gather and relax the minor and subtle precepts. And so this is what it says in the Vinaya Matrika Sutra, which is a Theravada scripture. In any case, the Buddha considered it important that after my nirvana, and once I've passed away, in other words, the Sangha members should all gather in one place and relax the minor and the subtle precepts, he said. But one difficulty that arose is that at that time, the Buddha said at that time, after I've passed away, you should gather on the summit, you should then relax the minor and subtle precepts. Then at that time, Ananda didn't, when the Buddha said that, should have asked the Buddha at that time. So when he said, he didn't say, what constitutes a minor precept, or what is this extent of this? Is it from here to here is minor precepts, and from here and above that is above this is not, and below that is? You need to say that clearly, right? The Buddha needs to say that, and you need to ask that. But Ananda didn't ask, and because he didn't ask, the later then Mahakashapa criticized Ananda. And so one of the points Mahakashapa criticized Ananda about is that he didn't ask him at the right time when he had the opportunity to say to identify what was meant by minor and subtle precepts. It didn't say, what is the scope of minor? What is the level of that? You didn't ask that, and so this is your mistake. So he criticized Ananda. Now, at that time, during the first council, the Sangha did discuss what the minor and subtle precepts meant, and some said, and so some said, oh, this is how you understood it. And some other people, no, that's not it. You should understand it like that. In other words, each arhat had their own understanding of what was meant by the minor and subtle precepts. But there was no unanimity. If there had been sort of consensus about this, then they immediately would have let them go. But there was no consensus. Because there was no consensus, what Mahakashapa said is that so basically, here's the meaning. This is a rough translation of this. And so you haven't agreed on what the minor and subtle precepts are. If we agree on what they are, then we can decide what to do that. But we don't have agreement, then we shouldn't relax them. And there are two reasons. The first of them is that if we relax the minor and the subtle precepts, or if we discard them, then what the non-Buddhists are going to say is that, look at them. The Buddha decided, they immediately forget about the minor and the subtle precepts. And all the dharma of the Buddha will then die out like wood after a wood fire. So if we abandon the minor and subtle precepts, we would only keep the four defeats, and then basically all the rest would have to be given up, because at that time, when they talked about there was at that time when they discussed it, the four defeats, everyone agreed that they were not minor precepts. So these four root precepts were no one ever thought them. And probably alcohol also was, there's probably no one who said that those were minor precepts, but the other ones, the 13 remainders and so forth, there were people who said that each of them were minor subtle precepts. And so when you look at it, and so basically, then essentially you'd only have the four defeats left and none of the others. If we only keep the four defeats, then how can we call ourselves spiritual practitioners? So we can't give them up. We need to continue to keep to hold them. In any case, this is what the Mahakashyapa decided. The main point here is that to prevent Vinaya discipline from becoming too lax. If you are relaxed too much, then the Vinaya practice becomes too lax, and so you need to prevent that from happening. Likewise, it's also to prevent criticism from the non-Buddhists who say we're relaxing too much. And additional, at that time, within the Sangha, it's like the discipline at that time was not so good. As I mentioned the other day, after the Buddha passed away, immediately there was a bhikshu said, okay, we're free now. And the past, the Buddha was really too strict with us and how difficult. So now we're free, he said. So there were people who said that. So at that point, for these reasons, the situation in the Sangha was not so good. If you relax it even further, then it's not so good. So at any point, that point, Mahakashyapa, the elder, was at that point, during the first council, he had become the leader of the Sangha. And he was also the one who presided over the first council. So as the leader, then, as the president of the council, he made this decision, as I said before. We aren't going to relax anything, he said. So basically the final decision was that we should follow what the Buddha taught and celebrate it, he said. What the Buddha did not say is not for us to explain here. What he's saying is that if the Buddha made a rule, so if the Buddha didn't make a rule, we aren't going to make a new rule. But the rules that the Buddha did make, we are going to continue to follow. So that was the decision. Now, what some people say is that the Mahakashyapa so we can say that Mahakashyapa. So the question, but this alone does not mean that Mahakashyapa's faction was actually the most conservative. Just the fact that he said that they couldn't change the rules and make new rules, you couldn't relax the rules, does not mean that it's the more conservative. Now, on one perspective, then what Mahakashyapa said is that they're very conservative, and that they're very kind of very rigid, you could say. But in actual practice, Mahakashyapa was not actually too extreme. He was not ultra conservative and completely rigid. He was not like that. Now, the way we know this is that during the compilation of the Vinaya, then Purana, so that the Buddha said that there are the 8 points regarding eating. So these 8 points regarding eating, the Buddha taught me these 8 points regarding eating. And since the Buddha told me, so when we, but Mahakashyapa wouldn't allow that to be included in that, and in the Vinaya. So if we think about this, we see that Kashyapa, in terms of the way of thought, was more conservative, but in practice, he was a little bit more in greater accord with the liberal factions. So when during a practice, you couldn't be too extreme. You had to be a little bit more liberal in your practice. And so for these reasons, then Mahakashyapa, from one perspective, and said that we have to follow the rules that the Buddha made. This is, in that aspect, he was very conservative, but on the other aspect, he was more liberal at that point. So the way he practiced it was actually a way that could bring the Sangha together and make the Sangha more harmonious. But the way Mahakashyapa conducted it did not necessarily mean that the disputes about the Vinaya would be, that there would never be any disputes, and that there would not be different views in the Sangha. This does not show that at all. Within the Sangha, as time changed, then the disputes within the Sangha about the Vinaya became greater and greater, and there are two primary reasons for this. And among these two reasons, the first is that Buddhism spread to remote lands. At first, it was primarily in the cities of central India. Then it moved to remote lands and areas that were areas where there's very little development. And they encountered many new difficulties in these regions. Likewise, even in the older Buddhist areas, there are many new social situations. So not in new places, but even in the places that had already been Buddhist, there are many new social situations, politicals, and people had different ideas. Because of these changes, these new situations and new difficulties actually required either a further revision of the Vinaya or a further review of the Vinaya, or you need to allow new flexibility in the older precepts, or you need to establish new precepts. In any case, these issues in the Vinaya became an important issue that the Sangha really needed to confront. And the reason is because of the time change, the environment change, that naturally the situation of the Vinaya, so there were issues that once again had to be looked at. They needed to go over them again in detail. So thank you. So that is enough for tonight. We can leave it here.